Welcome back to Tales Arcane, where we talk about D&D, ttrpgs, and fantasy storytelling. There's one big mistake that I think a lot of GMs make when they're first starting out, and I know about this because I made the exact mistake in my own first campaign. That mistake relates to BBEGs, the big bad evil guy, and I'm going to outline it in this video. Before I do that, a quick shout out to all the wonderful people who back me over on Patreon. If you subscribe to the Tales Arcane Patreon, you can get access to more than 1,000 pages of my original homebrew content. It includes travel encounters, adventures, campaign settings, and a lot more, plus the Patreon-only Discord. If you want to support me there, you can jump to a link below this video, or if you want to stay here on YouTube and just support through this, you can like and subscribe. That's all greatly appreciated. Now, let's talk about that big mistake that I made and that I see so many others making. If you've decided to run your own D&D campaign, an adventure that is created by you rather than a pre-written module created by Wizards of the Coast or some other third-party publisher, there's going to be a moment early on where you start thinking about your BBEG, the big bad evil guy, the nemesis that the players are going to probably work their way towards across the course of the entire campaign and have a final showdown with at the very end of the campaign. I think most GMs dream of having an epic BBEG, an epic villain that really stands out in the players' minds and who feels like a really worthy opponent at the end of a long campaign. And while that's very understandable, a big mistake, the big mistake that I see a lot of new GMs making, is getting fixated on a certain BBEG and trying their best to funnel the campaign towards that BBEG, trying their best to run that villain as they originally envisioned them, even as the campaign and the players within it morph and change direction to the point where that villain is no longer really the appropriate villain for this adventure. My first campaign took almost 2 years to complete, and I had a pretty clear idea of who the villain was going to be from the very start. I had him worked out in my mind, I understood his motivations, I understood his long-term plan, and I thought he was a pretty great villain. He was like this spurned apprentice of an ancient god who'd struck off on his own with secret knowledge and was planning to instigate a massive world-ending war between the Feywild and the material plane. It was all pretty epic. But along the way, the players kind of went off in a direction I didn't expect, and they became not quite criminals, but they certainly began to lean into a more kind of profiteering, self-interested approach. They were going from town to town, and sure, they were helping out, but they weren't doing it for the satisfaction, they were doing it for the gold. And they got quite excited about the idea of, yes, getting a reputation, but also being these kind of shrewd, almost anti-hero figures as they went from one town to the next. And as time went on, I started to wonder if perhaps they weren't going to be as excited about saving the world as I was. They weren't going to be as concerned about that epic war that was going to potentially wipe out the material plane, because that was all farther down the road, and what they were really excited about was maybe, fleecing the gang boss that they were trying to scam in the next town. That was where their focus was. But I was so fixed on that final villain that I kept guiding things slowly towards them. And I wasn't railroading them, but I kept on bringing in hints of this villain. They kept on bumping into his accomplices, seeing his work out in the world, seeing people who were, suffering because of this villain's actions. And my players just weren't really the altruistic types. So they were seeing these things, and they were getting a general sense that, I guess we have to go and fight this guy at some point. But there was no element where they really felt motivated, because that just wasn't their villain. It was my villain, and that was the problem. In the end, I managed to pull it out of the bag to some extent. There was a mercenary group that the players really hated, and they genuinely felt animus towards. So I had that mercenary group, connect with that villain I wanted the players to go up against and kind of become his lackeys to make it feel a little bit more personal. I had a close NPC betray them. It turned out that he was in service of the villain as well, and although it wasn't a perfect solution, it did add a little bit more of a personal stake to things when the players finally went up against that villain. We had a great epic final battle, and we wrapped things up. But afterwards, during our kind of post-campaign recap, the players admitted to me that they didn't really care about that villain. They cared about pretty much everything around the villain, and then the villain was just the icing on the cake. So what can we learn from this? Going forward, I used a different and, in my opinion, better approach. When I start a new campaign, I have no idea who the BBEG might be. I may have a general sense of some of the events I want to see happen in the later stages of the campaign. I might know that at some point there's going to be a demon invasion, or at some point there's going to be a war that the players might get involved with. But At no point do I have a clear sense of who that final threat is going to be. And instead, I have a whole a rogues gallery of people out in the world who might end up being the villain. And I'm going to have the players encounter them and their servants along the way, and I'm just going to see who the players respond to. At the end of the day, I'd much rather have the players genuinely excited about a villain, and have that villain be someone that maybe I didn't really have as my first choice, versus the players kind of eventually realizing who I want them to fight and going and fighting them. At the end of the day, I'm having a better time if my players are having a better time, and my players are having a better time if they're going up against a villain who they feel they've almost chosen themselves. By all means, create an epic villain, but don't stop at one. Create multiple epic villains and scatter them throughout your world, and then watch the players closely, because you will see them gravitate towards one over another when they encounter the minions of a villain. When they hear rumours of the villain's deeds, you'll see that they seem more interested and engaged in one over the other. If there are elements of certain villains that you really like, but the players don't seem to be interested in those villains, you can kind of gut them for parts and take elements of their lore or their abilities or their henchmen and add them to whatever villain the players do seem to be gravitating towards. We focused on the BBEG here, but really I think this goes to a wider point, which is that while you're planning out your campaign, and while you're getting the general sense of where the players might go, what themes they might encounter along the way, having too concrete an idea of where you think things are going to go, and then getting a little bit too attached to that idea yourself can be a problem, because you end up either pushing the players in a direction they don't naturally want to go, or just being disappointed yourself when things you plan don't work out. By all means, have those ideas out there, have a general sense of where things might go, but always be ready for things to take an unexpected turn. At the end of the day, while you might be the author of the world, people read books for the characters, and the players are your characters. So let them go out into the world, let them tell you who that final villain is. I hope this video has been helpful to you. And of course, you might not agree with this. You might think that, well, maybe the villain should be set in stone from the start. And if that villain doesn't appeal to the players, then either you've got the wrong players or you're not DMing right. And although I disagree with that myself, I understand that point of view, and I would love to hear about it in the comments. I don't want this to be me saying that my opinion is gospel here. It's really not, but I've seen what worked for me, what didn't work for me, and hopefully I can share that with you guys and help out a little bit, especially if you're new to the hobby or you're maybe coming into DMing for the first time. Anyway, if you're interested in backing me, I have the Patreon, like, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video.